The last tendrils of twilight bled from the sky, painting the western horizon in shades of bruised plum and faded amethyst as I steered my old sedan down the winding road. The engine's tired hum was the only sound for miles, a fragile protest against the encroaching stillness. Oakhaven. The name itself felt like a whisper of forgotten things, a place I had cleaved myself from years ago, severing ties with the ancestral roots that now, like insistent, gnarled tendrils, pulled me back. My grandmother's cryptic death, a sudden, unexplained cessation, had been the summons. A duty, yes, but also a gnawing curiosity, a need to understand the silence she'd left behind. The air grew heady, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles pressing in from the ancient skeletal trees that lined the asphalt. They stood like gaunt sentinels, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a tunnel of deepening gloom. Then, the town sign, Oakhaven, hand-carved, weathered, almost swallowed by ivy. Beneath it, a smaller plaque, obscured by moss, read simply, "Founded 1712. No welcoming message. No population count, just a stark declaration of age, an assertion of its persistent, silent existence. The town itself was unnaturally quiet. The main street, a narrow ribbon of cracked pavement, was deserted. The diner, where I'd once eaten greasy breakfasts with my grandmother, was shuttered, a closed sign hanging crookedly. Even the wind, when it stirred, seemed to hold its breath, rustling through dry leaves with a hushed, almost apologetic sigh. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the occasional parked car, their forms indistinct beneath a fine layer of dust. I saw no movement, heard no sound beyond the gravel crunching under my tires. This wasn't the Oakhaven I remembered. A town always drowsy, yes, but never silent. He was placing a small, wilting bouquet of wildflowers on the stoop. As I drove slowly past, her head turned, a slow, deliberate pivot that felt less like a human action and more like the movement of a marionette. There was no flicker of curiosity, no hint of surprise at a stranger's sudden appearance, just a profound, unsettling blankness. It was as if she looked through me, not at me. Further down, by the old clock tower whose hands had long since frozen at 3:15, an elderly man sat on a bench. He was staring straight ahead, his gaze fixed on nothing, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. As my car approached, he didn't stir. His posture was too perfect, too still. He seemed less a living man and more a carefully arranged tableau. I slowed, expecting him to turn, perhaps offer a nod, but he remained utterly motionless, a statue carved from flesh and bone, his eyes reflecting the fading sky with the same lifeless sheen as the glass of the abandoned storefronts. A distinct feeling of being watched began to coalesce, not from any specific point, but from everywhere at once. It was an omnipresent pressure, a subtle weight on the nape of my neck, a sensation of countless unseen eyes tracking my every move. Finally, the familiar turn-off, a gravel lane, overgrown with weeds, leading to the house where I'd spent fragmented summers and forgotten holidays. It stood on a slight rise, silhouetted against the last vestiges of the sky, its gables sharp, its windows like vacant sockets. My grandmother's home, the place where my earliest memories had taken root, now awaiting my return like a silent, patient sentinel. A creeping vine, thicker than I remembered, had begun to coil around the support pillars, its tendrils reaching toward the roof like grasping fingers. The front door, a heavy oak slab, yielded with a groan. When the overhead fixture flickered to life, the familiar hallway stretched before me. But something was immediately, terribly wrong. The coat rack, a sturdy piece of carved mahogany, stood where it always had, but the wallpaper behind it, a pattern of faded roses, was now a plain, chipped cream. And beyond that, where the small powder room should have been, was a solid, unblemished wall. My breath caught in my throat. I walked further in, my footsteps echoing. To my left, the living room, or at least, where the living room should have been. The grand fireplace, the worn armchair, the bay window overlooking the overgrown garden, all gone. In their place, a corridor that simply wasn't there before. My heart began to hammer, a frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't just age, it was fundamentally altered. The kitchen, once a warm, bustling space, was a sterile, stainless steel room, devoid of any personal touches, the window overlooking the backyard now looking out onto a brick wall. The staircase, which should have led up to the bedrooms, now angled sharply, ending abruptly at a solid, unyielding ceiling. No landing, no upper floor, just a dead end, an architectural lie. This was my childhood home, yes, but it was slightly wrong rooms in the wrong order, not merely rearranged, but fundamentally reconfigured, twisted into a disorienting labyrinth that defied all memory and logic. I stood in the middle of what should have been the dining room was now a bare, echoing chamber. The feeling of being watched intensified, not from outside. The undertaker, a man whose skin seemed stretched taut over his bones like ancient parchment, met me at the door of the funeral parlor. His gaze, distant and unblinking, held a placid emptiness that made the air around him feel thin, like a breath held too long. The scent of lilies, cloying and sweet, already clung to the air, a sickly perfume masking something deeper, more final. I stepped inside, the worn carpet swallowing the sound of my shoes, and the silence descended, heavy as a shroud. A handful of faces, drawn and indistinct, dotted the rows of padded chairs. My grandmother lay in an open casket, a pale echo of the woman I remembered. Her hands, clasped delicately over her chest, seemed too still, too perfect. The undertaker's art had smoothed away the sharp angles of her life, leaving behind a porcelain mask that barely hinted at the fierce spirit I'd known. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing a tableau, not a farewell. No tears came, only a dull ache that resonated with the town's muted sorrow. The service was a whisper, a collection of vague platitudes delivered by the local pastor, his voice a drone that seemed to flatten the very air. He spoke of my grandmother's kindness, her quiet strength, but the words felt hollow, devoid of the vibrant, sometimes difficult woman I'd known. The few mourners, mostly elderly, nodded in unison, their expressions uniform, a collective, placid grief that felt unsettlingly rehearsed. No one wept openly, no one offered a raw, heartfelt eulogy. It was a ritual performed by rote, a memory played on a skipping loop. After the brief, hushed ceremony, as the undertaker silently closed the casket, I moved among the scattered attendees, a ghost seeking recognition. I saw the baker, his hands usually dusted with flour, now clasped stiffly before him. "It's Cole," I said, extending a hand. "I remember your apple tarts. Grandmother always said they were the best." The baker's eyes, a milky blue, blinked slowly. "Cole," he repeated, the name a foreign sound on his tongue. He took my hand, his grip surprisingly weak. "Yes, you're your grandmother. A good woman." He paused, his gaze drifting over my shoulder as if searching for a cue. "Apple tarts, you say?" Just a polite, vacant assent. I remembered a time, years ago, when he would leave a small tart on her doorstep every Tuesday. A tradition that had spanned decades. Had he forgotten? Or was it just me, clinging to old stories? I spotted the librarian, a woman whose spectacles usually rested on the tip of her nose, now perched high on her forehead, forgotten. "Hello," I began. "I remember when grandmother used to bring me to the library. You always knew just the right adventure novel for me." She smiled, a thin, papery thing that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, yes, the library. A wonderful place for stories." Her voice was soft, even. "Your grandmother, he was a quiet reader, wasn't she? Always preferred the poetry section." My brow furrowed. "Poetry?" "No, she loved historical fiction. She'd spend hours poring over old biographies." I remembered the stacks of well-worn hardcovers in her study, not a single poetry anthology among them. The librarian tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Perhaps my memory isn't what it used to be. So many books. You see," she waved a dismissive hand, her eyes still holding that placid, distant quality. It wasn't the dismissive gesture of an old woman, but rather one of someone whose internal filing system had simply recategorized information without any sense of contradiction. I moved on, seeking out the shopkeeper from the general store, a portly man who used to slip me peppermint sticks when my grandmother wasn't looking. "It's Cole," I said, trying to infuse my voice with a familiar warmth. "I heard about grandmother. I'm so sorry." The shopkeeper nodded, his expression unreadable. "A sad day for Oakhaven. Your grandmother, he was always particular about her tea." "Earl Grey, wasn't it?" "No," I corrected, my voice tighter than I intended. "She hated Earl Grey, said it tasted like old potpourri. She drank black tea, always strong and plain." He frowned, a tiny furrow appearing between his brows, then smoothed away as quickly as it came. "Did it? Well, I suppose one forgets the specifics after a while. So many customers, you see." He offered a shrug, a gesture of resignation that felt more like a surrender to an unseen current. Each interaction was a blunt instrument striking against the fragile glass of my own recollections. They remembered her, yes, but their memories were like reflections in a warped mirror, recognizable, yet profoundly distorted. They spoke of her as if she were a composite character, an amalgamation of vague virtues, rather than the sharp, complex woman I knew. It was as if a sculptor had taken a chisel to their minds, shaving off the sharp edges of personal history, leaving only smooth, featureless surfaces. I left the funeral parlor with a buzzing in my skull, a frantic echo of unanswered questions. The world outside, though still cloaked in the muted light of afternoon, felt sharper, more hostile. The air, once thick with the cloying scent of lilies, now tasted metallic, like something vital had been drained from it. Was I the one who was wrong? Had my memory, honed by years of absence, somehow invented details, embellished truths, while theirs, dulled by constant presence, had simply faded? The drive to my grandmother's house was a blur of familiar streets streets made alien by the disorienting conversations. When I finally parked my sedan in the gravel driveway, the house stood before me, a sentinel of silent brick and peeling paint. I pushed open the front door, the wood groaning a tired protest, and stepped into the quiet gloom. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint, lingering scent of lavender and aged paper. I walked through the living room, my hand trailing along the back of a floral armchair, but something was wrong. The grandfather clock, usually a proud sentinel by the fireplace, stood in the alcove where the coat rack should have been. The dining room, which should have been to my left, was now a small, windowless pantry. The familiar layout of my youth had been subtly, yet fundamentally, altered. Each doorway led to an unexpected space, a quiet defiance of memory. It was as if the house itself was mocking me, mirroring the fractured recollections of the town, confirming the unsettling suspicion that my own mind was no longer a reliable compass. Each inflection of the shopkeeper's voice, each subtle shift of his gaze had been a tiny erosion of what I understood. My grandmother's house, perched on a rise overlooking the skeletal trees of the old forest, seemed to watch my approach with hollow, vacant eyes. The porch swing, once a vibrant red, sagged gray and splintered. The window boxes, where she'd cultivated riotous geraniums, were now brittle nests of dead stalks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust, dried lavender, and something else of faint, metallic tang like old copra left in the rain. It was disorienting, a quiet assault on my spatial memory, and it prickled the hairs on my arms. My task was to clear the house, to sift through the remnants of a life that had ended so abruptly, so cryptically. I began in her study, a room usually neat, now a chaotic jumble of papers, books, and forgotten trinkets. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grimy window panes. My hands, hesitant at first, moved methodically, lifting old ledgers, sorting through stacks of yellowed correspondence. Each item felt heavy with unspoken history, each surface coated in a fine, soft powder of neglect. It wasn't paper or cloth. I pulled out a small, wooden box, intricately carved with swirling, organic patterns that seemed to writhe beneath my touch. There was no lock, no latch, only a perfectly fitted lid that lifted with the soft sigh of displaced air. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling leaves I couldn't identify, lay a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was unadorned, save for the same unsettling, intertwined symbols carved subtly into the surface, mirroring those on the box. The leather felt supple yet ancient, almost alive under my fingertips. A curious tremor ran through me, a premonition that this was not just another relic, but a key. The ink was faded in places, vibrant in others, as if penned at different times, with different intensities of emotion. The handwriting was my grandmother's, unmistakable in its elegant loops and sharp angles, but it grew increasingly erratic, frantic, almost desperate as I turned the brittle leaves. The first entries were mundane, observations about the changing seasons, notes on gardening. Then, the tone shifted. The air grows thick with them. They are not sounds, not truly, but a pressure against the mind. Further on, the script became a jagged scrawl, interspersed with crude drawings of the same symbols that adorn the journal's cover, intricate, unsettling designs that felt primal, somehow wrong. They take the edges first. The small things, names, faces, the taste of rain, then the stories. The town is forgetting itself, and I feel it tugging at my own threads. The forgetting. This was it. This was what I had felt in the shopkeeper, what I had sensed in the air of Oakhaven. It wasn't just old age or confusion. It was something actively erasing. Our ancestors knew. They built the town upon the mouth of it, a ward against the ancient hunger. A pact, a sacrifice of memory to keep it sleeping. But the pact weakens. The forgetting is its breath. My family, we were the keepers, the watchers, and now I am alone. My family, my grandmother, she hadn't just been a quirky old woman, he had been a guardian, a keeper of some terrible, ancient secret tied to Oakhaven's very foundation. The journal hinted at a deep, primal entity, a silent consciousness that fed on the very fabric of remembrance. They called to me. They promised peace, the cessation of striving, if only I would let go. Let go of what I know. This wasn't just a metaphor. My grandmother hadn't simply died. He had been consumed. The journal slipped from my trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, a taste of something ancient and hungry, stirring beneath the forgotten earth of Oakhaven. I was no longer just coal, investigating a peculiar death. I was a thread, suddenly pulled taut, caught in a vast, unseen tapestry, and whatever was weaving it was just beginning to stir. The journal lay splayed, a testament to a truth too cruel to bear, its pages still whispering of consumption. My grandmother hadn't simply departed. He had been absorbed, dissolved into something vast and insatiable. The thought was a physical weight, pressing against my lungs, stealing the air. A cold bloom, indeed, but now it was a thorny vine tightening around my heart. I stooped, my fingers clumsy, to retrieve the fallen book. Its leather cover, once smooth, now felt like parched skin beneath my touch. The dust motes danced in the slivers of light slicing through the grimy window panes, oblivious to the monstrous revelation I had just unearthed. It began subtly, a faint rustling at the very edge of my hearing, like leaves skittering across a distant cobblestone path. I paused, tilting my head, straining. Nothing, just the groan of settling timber, the sigh of old wood. I spun, scanning the empty hallway, the closed doors. The air, thick with the scent of age and forgotten things, offered no answers. The pantry, which I remembered off the kitchen, now opened into the small, rarely used study. The guest bedroom, once adjacent to mine, was now across the hall, its door ajar, revealing a sliver of unfamiliar wallpaper. Each misplacement was a tiny, unnerving tremor, a testament to a reality subtly warped. They were like a chorus of distant voices, overlapping and indistinct, a sonic tapestry woven from forgotten murmurs. Not words, not quite, but the sound of speech, a continuous, low thrumming that frayed the edges of my sanity. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the vibration seemed to come from inside me, rattling the bones of my skull. Fleeting, darting movements in my peripheral vision, a deepening of the gloom in a corner, a momentary flicker of something denser than air passing through a doorway. I would whip my head around, my gaze locking onto the spot, but there was never anything there. It was like trying to catch smoke, a maddening dance of perception and absence. My eyes began to ache from the constant vigilance, my neck stiff from the jerking movements. It wasn't the sudden shock of fear, but a creeping, insidious certainty of impending doom. Every creak of the house, every shift of light, every breath I took seemed imbued with this heavy, terrible foreboding. It felt as though the very air I breathed was thinning, becoming insubstantial, preparing me for a similar fate. The quiet streets of Oakhaven, usually bustling with a handful of familiar faces, felt eerily sparse. I stopped at the general store, its bell jingling a lonely tune. The proprietor, a stoic woman with eyes like chipped slate, greeted me with him usual curt nod. "Morning, Cole," he rasped, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a few provisions. "Is the baker in today? I was hoping to pick up some of his rye bread." The proprietor paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, then back to me. "The baker? Oh, he's keeping to himself these days. Not much call for rye bread, I suppose." Her expression remained impassive, betraying no flicker of surprise or concern at his absence. It was as if the baker had simply ceased to exist, and his disappearance was of no consequence. My stomach clenched. The baker, a jovial man with flour perpetually dusting his mustache, was a fixture of Oakhaven. He never kept to himself. He lived for the morning rush, the scent of yeast and warmth. Later, I saw the librarian walking her terrier, a small, yapping creature that always greeted me with enthusiasm. Today, the librarian walked alone, her hand gripping an empty leash. The librarian blinked, a faint smile touching her lips. "Come Bennett? Oh, I don't have a dog." Cole, her eyes, usually sharp behind her spectacles, seemed to hold a vague, unfocused quality. The knot tightened. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was an erasure. The entity my grandmother wrote of wasn't just consuming memories, it was consuming the very people who held them. Oakhaven was not merely forgetting, it was being unmade. And I, the last one to truly remember, was next. The cool air of the general store clung to me, a thin, persistent chill that mirrored the proprietor's blank gaze. Her words, "Not much call for rye bread, I suppose," echoed with a hollowness that had nothing to do with baked goods and everything to do with the town's silent erosion. I had left the store, the bell above the door jangling a brief, tinny protest against the pervasive quiet, and stepped back into Oakhaven's muted afternoon. The sun, a pale coin in a sky of washed-out blue, offered little warmth. My grandmother's journal, a heavy weight in my satchel, felt like the only solid thing left in this place. Its pages, brittle with age, held the last vestiges of a mind unbent, unlike the town's collective consciousness, which now seemed to flow like a shallow, muddy river, its banks eroding into a vast, featureless plain. The entity I sought, scrawled in her elegant, looping hand, spoke of the churning heart forgotten. Where the old words sleep. I knew she meant the mill. The path out of town was overgrown, the asphalt cracked and yielding to tenacious weeds. I could feel its pressure on my eardrums, a subtle hum that seemed to vibrate from the very earth. Ahead, through a screen of skeletal trees, the mill loomed. It was a skeletal beast itself, all angles and decaying timber, its skeletal water wheel frozen in a perpetual, agonizing turn. Rust bled down the corrugated iron siding, staining the ground a deep, sickly ochre. A faint metallic scent, like old blood and damp earth, wafted on the still air. The main door, a warped slab of oak, hung ajar, groaning faintly as a phantom breeze stirred it. The air inside was thick, tasting of mildew and the sharp tang of forgotten industry. Motes of dust, disturbed by my entrance, danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, swirling like restless spirits. Massive, silent machinery, caked in decades of grime, stood like petrified giants. Gears, flywheels, and conveyor belts, all once humming with purpose, were now merely monuments to a bygone era. This place had a pulse once, a violent, rhythmic beat that had long since stilled, leaving behind only the ghost of its industry. My finger traced the faded sketch he had included, a series of intricate, looping symbols, almost like a language I couldn't quite decipher, but distinctly ancient. Beneath the sketch, a single cryptic phrase, where the grain was ground, look beneath the turning. The old grinding stones. I scanned the cavernous space. There in the center of the main floor, sat a colossal pair of millstones, their surfaces rough and pitted, surrounded by a collapsed wooden chute. This was it. I knelt, brushing away layers of dust and debris from the base of the millstones. It took time, minutes that stretched into an eternity of quiet searching, my eyes straining in the dim light. And then, my fingers snagged on something. Not a flaw in the stone, but a deliberate indentation. I followed it, my heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. There, partially obscured by moss and a thick crust of grime, were the carvings. They matched the journal perfectly, not just the looping symbols, but the overall design, a repeating pattern that seemed to coil and uncoil, like something both ancient and alive. They were deeply etched into the base of the millstone, almost as if the stone itself had been sculpted by some forgotten hand. It was a resonance, a faint echo of the same unsettling emptiness I felt radiating from the town. The carvings didn't just adorn the stone, they seemed to be a part of it, flowing around the section that appeared slightly different, a subtle seam in the otherwise monolithic surface. I pressed against it, then again, harder, testing. Nothing. I ran my hands over the entire area, searching for a latch, a lever, any indication of a mechanism. The journal entry's phrase, "Look beneath the turning," echoed in my mind. I moved around the millstone, examining the floors surrounding it. I noticed a faint discoloration, a line in the dust that suggested a recent disturbance, or perhaps a slight shift. With renewed determination, I pushed and pulled at the edge of the large, circular plank that encompassed the millstone. It resisted, groaning. I put my shoulder into it, straining. Slowly, with a deep, rasping scrape of wood against wood, the section of the floor began to pivot inward. No stairs, just a steep, earthen slope disappearing into the unseen. My breath hitched in my throat, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. The old words, the churning hurt. Deeper, always deeper. The silence pressed in, a suffocating shroud woven from damp earth and forgotten time. My breath, a ragged whisper, plumed before me in the frigid air of the old mill. Beneath the collapsed wooden chute, where the grain once flowed, a gap yawned. It was not a natural fissure, but a crude, deliberate opening, as if the millstones themselves had been shifted, or the earth beneath them had given way under an immense, unseen pressure. A faint metallic scent, like old blood mixed with wet soil, tickled the back of my throat. Hesitation was a luxury I could not afford. The entity, whatever it was, thrived beneath this town, a subterranean parasite. This was the way down. I slid feet first into the opening, the rough-hewn stone scraping against my jacket. The passage narrowed immediately, forcing me to crawl on hands and knees, my bag dragging behind me. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and mineral. My light cut a wavering path through the absolute black, revealing walls of packed earth and unmortared rock, sweating with an unnatural dampness. The passage sloped sharply, a relentless descent into the earth's maw. I felt the pressure of the tons of earth above me, a palpable weight that seemed to press not just on my body, but on my very thoughts. The world above, with its muted sunlight and vacant-eyed inhabitants, felt impossibly distant, a fading dream. The air here was still, stagnant, yet carried a subtle, rhythmic thrum, like a distant, massive heartbeat. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing strange, shallow carvings. Not symbols I recognized, but jagged, repetitive patterns that seemed to writhe and intertwine, like roots seeking purchase in stone. They were crude, yet disturbingly intentional, etched deep into the rock. Further on, the tunnel opened into a series of smaller, interconnected chambers. Here, the floor was not merely earth, but strewn with a fine, bone-white dust. I knelt, picking up a shard. It was brittle, porous, unmistakably organic. My light lingered, then widened to encompass the disturbing tableau. Not animal bones, these were human. Femurs, Ribs, fragments of skulls, ancient and bleached, lay amidst pebbles and the unsettling dust. Some were clustered, others solitary, as if dropped carelessly or left as an offering. This was not a natural burial ground. This was a place of ritual, of sacrifice. I pressed on, the rhythmic thrum growing louder, more insistent. The tunnels twisted, a bewildering labyrinth that seemed to defy logic, each turn blurring the memory of the last. I started to feel disoriented, a creeping sense that the very geography of this place was shifting, mocking my attempts to navigate. Then I saw it. The tunnel opened into a larger cavern, but this was no natural rock formation. It was a space that mimicked, with grotesque precision, the layout of a familiar dwelling. A doorway, though crudely carved from the living rock, led into what felt like a hallway. A sense of perverse recognition washed over me. The kitchen was where the living room should have been, a rough-hewn rock counter taking the place of a worn armchair. My flashlight beam, now trembling in my grip, found the source of the thrumming. In the center of this living room that was not a living room, where a hearth should have been, something grew. It was a mound of pulsing, organic tissue, anchored to the floor and walls by thick, rope-like tendrils that glistened with a slick, viscous sheen. It was vaguely hemispherical, roughly the size of a large armchair, and its surface was a mottled, sickly gray-pink, like raw flesh. From its apex, smaller, delicate filaments, almost hair-like, stretched into the air, swaying imperceptibly as if tasting the air. The thrumming intensified, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the rock floor, through my boots, up into my bones. It was the sound of something alive, something immense, something feeding. A low, wet squelching sound accompanied each throb of the mass, as if something within it was churning, digesting. This was it. This was the entity's influence, raw and undeniable. This was a feeder node, a living organ of the thing that consumed Oakhaven's memories. I had found it, and it was far, far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. The colossal millstones, scarred by centuries of grinding, stood like monuments to a vanished industry, their surfaces coursed beneath my searching fingers. A draft, not from a broken window, but from something deeper. A breath exhaled from the very belly of the earth. I followed it, my steps hushed on the loose grit, past rusted gears and splintered timber, to a section of the wall where the stone met bedrock in an uneven seam. Here, a darker, colder opening yawned. It was less a passage and more a jagged tear in the world, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The air grew heavier, tasting of mineral and age, a cold that seeped into my bones rather than merely touching my skin. I squeezed through, scraping my jacket on the rough stone, and descended into an absolute, lightless throat. My hand outstretched, found only slick rock, a downward slope that seemed endless. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My torch beam, a fragile spear, cut through the black, revealing nothing but glistening walls and the occasional drip of water, each drop echoing with unnerving clarity. The passage widened eventually, opening into a vast, cavernous space. Here, the air was still, yet it thrummed with a low, resonant hum, a sound that vibrated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. It was a chord of deep, ancient earth and something else, something softer, more insidious. Then I saw them. It wasn't light from any source I knew. It pulsed, a slow, organic breath, and within its luminescence, they gathered, dozens of them, townsfolk. They stood in a loose, shifting circle, their bodies swaying with an unnerving, synchronized rhythm. Their faces, illuminated by the spectral glow, were vacant, smooth as worn river stones. The shopkeeper, his spectacles gone, a faint smile playing on his lips. The old librarian, her usually sharp eyes now wide and unfocused. The fisherman, his weathered hands clasped loosely before him, and others, faces I knew from fleeting encounters, from childhood memories, all bearing the same placid, empty expression. No one spoke, no one acknowledged another. It was as if their individual minds had dissolved, their thoughts becoming a shared, formless current. They were feeding it, unknowingly, surely, their essence, their experiences, their very selves. The hum intensified, pulling at me, a soft, hypnotic drone that promised peace, release. A voice, not heard, but felt, suggested that all my burdens, my worries, my gnawing anxieties, could simply cease. I could let them go, surrender them to the collective, and become part of something vast, something eternal. My breath hitched. This was the entity. This was how it operated, not with claws or teeth, but with an insidious invitation to oblivion, a sweet, tempting erasure. They weren't suffering, they were content. They had given themselves over. The pull grew stronger, a gravitational force drawing me toward the shimmering circle. My legs felt heavy, my will a fragile reed against the current. It was a warmth, a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I craved. To simply be, without the weight of thought, without the pain of memory. Demurred, to become one with the vast, silent consciousness that permeated this cavern. I could feel my own memories, vivid and precious, begin to fray at the edges, tugged by an unseen hand. My grandmother's face, my mother's laughter, the taste of sea salt from childhood trips to the coast. They felt distant, threatened. This was not peace. It was annihilation. I was cold. I had to remain cold. My muscles screamed in protest as I forced them to move, to retreat, to tear myself away from the insidious allure. The hum pulsed, a silent accusation, as I stumbled backward, away from the glowing heart of the collective, toward the jagged opening that had led me into this subterranean nightmare. A draft, not from a broken window, but from something deeper, breathed against my skin. It carried the scent of wet stone and a faint, sweet decay, the kind that clings to ancient things. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath my boots, a resonance that was not sound so much as a pressure, a vast, patient breath. That hum intensified, a silent siren call. It was a beckoning, not with words, but with a profound sense of belonging, a promise of peace in relinquishing the burden of self. My thoughts began to fray at the edges, individual threads loosening, eager to be rewoven into a larger tapestry. Memories, sharp and distinct moments. My grandmother's laugh, the feel of the old swing set in the yard, the sting of a childhood scraped knee, softened, blurring into indistinct impressions. They felt less like mine and more like echoes of something shared, something vast and impersonal. A cold, unseen current tugged at the very core of me, a gentle suction threatening to draw my essence into the damp, echoing passages that stretched beneath the earth. It wasn't a violent pull, but an insidious invitation to dissolve, to join the quiet chorus that resonated from the deep. The chill of the underground permeated my bones, yet there was a warmth in the thought of surrendering, of letting go of the frantic scramble to understand, to fight. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, I felt the lure, the profound relief of simply being without the weight of I. Then, a flicker, a defiant spark in the encroaching stillness. It was the memory of my grandmother's cryptic notes, her hurried, desperate scrawl, the tangible proof of her struggle against this very oblivion. Her resistance became my anchor, the image of her face, etched with a sorrow I had never fully understood until now, pierced through the numbing calm he had fought. With a gasp that tore through the enveloping tranquility, I wrenched myself free. It felt like tearing wet cloth, a painful separation from an embrace I hadn't realized was holding me. My muscles screamed as I stumbled backward, away from the yawning maw of the subterranean passages. My head throbbed, my vision swam, the world tilting on an axis I no longer recognized. The night sky, a vast, indifferent canvas of obsidian, offered no comfort. I had felt it, truly felt it. The entity's power. It wasn't a predator that ripped and tore, but a devourer of consciousness, a sculptor of emptiness. It sought not death, but assimilation, a grand, silent consciousness formed from the husks of individual minds. The townsfolk, with their fractured memories and uniform behaviors, were not merely victims. They were extensions, their individuality slowly dissolving into the collective. The horror was not in gore, but in erasure of self, the quiet theft of every unique thought, every cherished memory, every fleeting dream. Oakhaven was not just being consumed. It was being rewritten, its inhabitants becoming mere conduits for a vast, ancient hunger. I staggered through the hushed streets, the houses looming like silent, watchful eyes. The familiar contours of the town now felt alien, imbued with the entity's pervasive influence. My feet, seemingly of their own accord, carried me towards my childhood home. But it was wrong, subtly, profoundly wrong. The kitchen, usually a bright, spacious area, felt cramped and oddly shaped. The cabinets rearranged into an unfamiliar pattern. The air was heavy, charged with the phantom presence of rearranged lives. I found my way to what should have been my grandmother's study, now a small, windowless chamber filled with forgotten boxes. I pulled out her worn leather-bound journals, their pages brittle with age, their margins filled with her frenetic, almost indecipherable script. My hands trembled as I leafed through them, searching for answers, for a weapon against the encroaching tide. He had understood, he had seen the threads, the connections. Her notes spoke of severing, of disrupting the current. She detailed specific points of convergence, ancient markers, places where the town's collective memory was most vulnerable, most intertwined with the entity's insidious tendrils. Her research wasn't just a record of her fears, it was a blueprint for resistance. My gaze fell upon a crude map tucked within the pages, marked with symbols I now recognized from the underground passages. A central nexus, a focal point where the entity drew its strength, where the threads of collective memory converged. It was deep, almost certainly beneath the heart of Oakhaven, perhaps even beneath the very mill I had just escaped. The plan coalesced in my mind, desperate and terrifyingly simple. The stakes were no longer just my survival, but the very essence of identity for an entire community. I would fight for Oakhaven, for my grandmother, for the memory of what it meant to truly be me. It pulsed, an insidious heartbeat, slow and deep, echoing the one thrumming a frantic rhythm in my own chest. The draft, still breathing against my skin, carried that scent of wet stone and sweet decay, a breath from some cavernous, forgotten place. My skin prickled, not from cold, but from an instinctual dread that coiled in my gut. I gripped my grandmother's journal, its brittle pages a fragile shield against the rising tide of unease. The house itself seemed to shift around me, a subtle, almost imperceptible rearrangement of familiar shadows, a whisper of a door where none should be. The hallway stretched a little too long, the living room a little too dim, as if the very architecture was succumbing to the creeping anemia that plagued Oakhaven. Time was a rapidly dissolving thread. My grandmother's scrawled notes were my only compass. I flipped through the journal, my eyes scanning for any hint, any word that might illuminate the path. The root feeds on the forgotten. One entry read, "But memory, truly held, is a blade." Another spoke of the convergence of echoes and a hearth of shared remembrance. It was also terribly vague, yet a pattern began to emerge. The entity's power lay in the erasure, in the blank spaces where Oakhaven's past should have been. The counter, then, must be the opposite, remembering. I couldn't fight a creeping tide of forgetting alone. I needed others, those few sparks I had seen, those fleeting moments of recognition in the eyes of the townsfolk. The air thickened, sweet, and cloying. The streets were quiet, the usual hum of daily life replaced by a pervasive stillness. I saw the baker, his hands moving with practiced, lifeless grace as he arranged loaves in his window, his gaze vacant. "Do you remember, old friend?" I began, trying to conjure a specific, shared memory. "The year of the big snow, when your oven broke, and my grandmother brought you her famous sourdough starter." His eyes, usually warm and crinkled at the corners, held no light. He merely blinked, his movements slowing, as if my words were a foreign language. A faint tremor passed through him, a brief flicker of something like confusion. Then it was gone, replaced by the same placid emptiness. He resumed arranging his bread, his motions perfectly uniform, perfectly meaningless. I tried another. The postmaster, sorting letters with an unnerving precision. "The old oak tree by the river," I urged, "the one we carved our initials into as boys. Do you remember its crooked branches?" He paused, a letter suspended between his fingers. His head tilted, a subtle shift, and for a fleeting moment, a shadow of an old smile touched his lips. His eyes darted, unfocused, as if searching for something just beyond his sight. But then, a shudder racked his frame, more pronounced than the baker's. His eyes cleared, but not with recognition. Rather, with a sharp, almost hostile clarity. He dropped the letter, his gaze fixed on me, devoid of warmth, devoid of anything human. He turned back to his work, his movements now stiff, deliberate, like a marionette. The momentary flash of memory had been a painful disruption, quickly smoothed over by the entity's pervasive influence. It wasn't just that they had forgotten. It was that the act of trying to remember caused them distress, as if their minds were actively rejecting the truth. The entity wasn't just erasing, it was actively defending its territory. The hum intensified, vibrating through the cobblestones beneath my boots, a silent chorus of forgotten thoughts. I retreated, the weight of Oakhaven's oblivion pressing down on me. I needed a stronger focal point, a specific memory, a concrete object around which to rally what remained. Flipping frantically through the brittle pages, a loose sketch fell out, a charcoal drawing of a familiar stone marker near the old town square, ringed by forgotten symbols. Beneath it, a single phrase was written in my grandmother's looping hand: "The first stone, the anchor of Oakhaven's heart. Where the memory began, there shall it end." My breath hitched. The old town square. Not just any memory, but the very genesis of Oakhaven, its foundation, its first shared dream. The symbols I now recognized were ancient protective runes, etched not to ward off, but to preserve. The first stone, a relic, yes, but more, a touchstone of collective memory. This was the weakness, the ritual. The core of the entity could be disrupted by forcing it to confront the very essence of Oakhaven's true, remembered beginning. The hum beneath my feet became a roar, a silent, furious protest. I had found it, now I just had to make them remember. The runes, etched into the ancient stone, pulsed in my mind's eye. A language forgotten by the living, yet suddenly articulate within me. They were not words I now understood, not against an invasion from without, but anchors for a preservation from within. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled and steeled me in equal measure, precisely where its heart must lie. My path led me not to sunlight, but to shadow, down into the forgotten places beneath Oakhaven. The passage narrowed, the stone walls weeping with ancient moisture, cool and slick beneath my fingertips. I felt a subtle hum, a vibration that resonated deep within my teeth. A silent song of assimilation. Then, the rough-hewn passage gave way, not to another cavern, but to a hallway. My breath hitched, caught in my throat like a shard of ice. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, was precisely as I remembered from my earliest years, yet the door to my grandmother's study was where the kitchen should have been. The scent of her lavender sachet, usually a comfort, was now strong, cloying, almost suffocating, a phantom presence that tightened around my lungs. This was the entity's insidious work, a memory woven from my own mind, twisted and presented as a gilded cage. I pushed through, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if my weight were an intrusion on an impossible impossible dream. Each room I passed was a distortion, a painful echo. It sought to disarm me with familiarity, to absorb me into the fabric of its own twisted reality. This was a trap, a psychic construct designed to break my will before I even reached its core. I clenched my jaw, the ghost of my grandmother's touch on my arm urging me onward through the deceit. I forced my way through the last distorted doorway, a portal that shimmered with the agony of misremembered joy. The illusion shattered like brittle glass, dissolving into motes of shimmering dust. And at its heart, the entity, it pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat that resonated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, a silent, thrumming that threatened to unravel my very being. Within its swirling depths, I saw them flickers of faces I have remembered, fragments of conversations overheard in childhood, the spectral outlines of Oakhaven's entire history, all woven into this vast, silent consciousness, like threads in an impossible tapestry. The collective, fragmented memories of generations, bound together, feeding this monstrous, beautiful thing that was both the town's essence and its slow devourer. My own memories, sharp and distinct, felt suddenly fragile, like glass beads tumbling onto a stone floor. My individual identity, my singular existence, felt like a defiance, an anomaly in the sea of unified thought. A desperate, brutal struggle began, not of physical strength, but of will and memory. It sought to dissolve me, to incorporate my unique experiences into its boundless, fractured whole. I saw flashes of my own life, my grandmother's hand, the scent of pine needles in the autumn air, the taste of salt from the distant sea. The entity tried to twist them, to integrate them into its own narrative, to erase their specific resonance and make them merely part of Oakhaven's grand, silent dream. I fought back, pushing against the encroaching tide with every fiber of my being. I was Cole, not a fragment, not a whisper in a collective dream, but an individual, whole and separate. The ancient runes I had seen etched to preserve individuality echoed in my mind. They were not just symbols. They were a counter-song, a defiant shout against the entity's unifying hum. My mind felt stretched, a thin membrane on the verge of tearing. The risk was immense, the cost potentially my sanity, my very self. The reckoning had begun, and I was its reluctant, desperate champion. Now, all of them scattered throughout Oakhaven's forgotten places sang with a silent, terrible purpose. They had been meant to hold the town's essence, its memories, safe. But the entity, a parasite of thought, had twisted their function, using them to tether its vast, silent consciousness to the very fabric of our lives, drawing us into its profound, memory-devouring stillness. My fingers, still tingling from the stone's cold touch, clenched. A determined tremor ran through me. I saw it, felt it, the vast, humming network beneath us, a tapestry woven from stolen recollections. To disrupt it, I had to sever those anchors, not break them, but retune them, make them sing a different song. A song of severance. A low thrum began in the air, not a sound I heard with my ears, but one that resonated deep within my bones. The world around me seemed to shimmer at the edges, the very light taking on a viscous quality. I closed my eyes, focusing on the mental map of Oakhaven I now possessed, overlaid with the glowing points of the runes. Each was a node, a point of communion, and each had to be undone. I pushed back against the entity's vast, encroaching silence, a pressure like deep-sea currents trying to crush me. Memories, not mine, but fragments from countless others, flickered through my mind. A child's laughter in a sun-drenched field, the scent of wood smoke from a distant hearth, the rough texture of a beloved tool in an old man's hand. They were beautiful, poignant, but they were borrowed, echoes without an origin. The entity was offering them a seductive feast, a promise of peace and absorption. But I remembered the blank eyes, the vacant smiles, the slow, creeping assimilation. This was not peace. This was erasure. With a mental roar that tore through the phantom landscape of shared thought, I twisted. I didn't just understand the runes. I became asterisk their counter-voice. The thrum intensified, becoming a high-pitched whine that vibrated behind my eyes. My vision blurred, tears stinging as if from an unseen wind. Then, a tearing sound, like ancient cloth ripping, echoed not in the air, but in the deepest parts of my skull. It was the sound of a vast, unseen connection being violently severed. The pressure in my mind broke, replaced by an agonizing, momentary vacuum. Then a wave of disorientation so profound it sent me stumbling. I gasped, air burning my lungs, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was back in my childhood home, slightly wrong rooms in the wrong order. The familiar, yet unsettling, layout seemed to writhe around me for a moment, walls blurring, the floor tilting as if the very architecture of reality was struggling to reassert itself. Then, with a shudder, it settled. The living room was still where the kitchen should have been. The staircase still led to a hallway I didn't recognize, but the frantic instability was gone. A profound, aching quiet descended. The air, once heavy with an unseen presence, now felt thin, sterile. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. Outside, a dog barked, sharp and distinct, then another, a distant echo. Sounds! Real, individual sounds met the uniform hum of the entity. Stepping out, the morning light, once muted, seemed to pierce my eyes. People moved, but with a hesitant, almost fragile gait. The old woman who ran the general store stood outside her shop, clutching a worn apron. Her eyes, which had held that unnerving, distant calm, now darted around, unfocused and bewildered. The sugar, she mumbled, her voice raspy. Where is it? She looked at me, a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, then a cloud of confusion. Oh, is that you, dear? Her brow furrowed, a network of forgotten worries etched onto her face. My, you grown. Have you come for the flour? Her gaze drifted, lost. A few yards away, the man who used to deliver milk stood by his truck, his hands running over the polished metal as if he'd never seen it before. He looked at his own reflection, then back at his hands, a deep frown creasing his brow. I think so. The town had been saved from erasure, but the victory was a costly one. The entity's hold was broken, but it had torn something vital from Oakhaven in its retreat. The uniformity was gone, replaced by a fractured landscape of minds. Some memories had returned, yes, but others were lost, perhaps forever. I walked through the streets, the air thick with an unspoken grief. Their faces, once blank, now held a raw, exposed vulnerability. They were like newborns or the recently awakened, trying to piece together a world that had been stolen from them. The choice pressed down on me, heavy as gravestone. Oakhaven was no longer a prison of silent minds, but a monument to trauma, a town of ghosts who had forgotten their own haunting. Could I help them rebuild, guide them through the labyrinth of their own shattered pasts?